John in Milford, Connecticut asks, what can we do to either rebrand the Republican Party or increase the awareness and support for a third party to surpass the Republican popularity?
I don't know. That is a difficult question. And, the Republican brand has been tarnished, but, I don't know what really they can do because there's a perception out there, I suppose, among a lot of young voters that the Republicans are anti-minorities, anti-women, you name it, all these groups. And of course, they're not anti them, but what the Republicans have to do is try to present an alternative picture other than a life of dependency and government handouts, and kind of reach out to the people who have been bought by the Democrats and try to at least peel off a little bit of that vote. They're never going to win, I think, the vote of the people who are living off of government. But there are some people who might prefer an alternative, who might respond to a message if it was properly delivered. The problem is most Republicans are afraid to tell the truth when it comes to these groups, and therefore they end up looking like hypocrites and running away instead of actually engaging the Democrats on that ideological battle. But I think what the Republicans really need to do, as far as the workers who are paying all the taxes and supporting the population that is living off of government, they have to do a better job of appealing to those people, because a lot of working men and women still voted for the Democrats. And maybe if the Republicans could really hold out a bigger carrot to go along with the stick of cutting spending, to really let the public know that they can enjoy significant tax relief. Maybe let's abolish the income tax if we get rid of all this government spending, and then let people actually know what they're voting in favor of when they're voting for a Democrat. They're voting to preserve the high rate of taxes that they pay. But maybe if we vote for a Republican, we won't have these taxes anymore. Instead, the Republican candidates still promise high taxes. They just promise that those taxes will be slightly lower than what the Democrats promise. And so that's probably not enough to get at a lot of the, the unaffiliated, some of the blue dog Democrat types who might be attracted to a real limited government free market candidate if there was something in it for them. Obviously, Obama appealed to his voters by buying them, giving them free stuff. Well, the Republicans need to appeal to voters by promising to stop taxing them so that other people can get free stuff. That's real relief. But if you're going to give that message and make it genuine, then you obviously have to cut spending dramatically to make it believable, and be willing to fight the good fight on why those spending cuts are necessary. And if it means you lose some votes, we'll lose some votes. But the Republicans are too afraid to look mean, and so they don't want to really attack the Democrats ideologically on these issues. And then, of course, the Republicans need to move away from getting, tied up in some of these social issues when it comes to birth control or abortion or rape. They just got to not take the bait when the Democrats bait them, and they got to keep religion out of politics. I mean, just don't answer these questions. I mean, if you're a religious candidate, just say, look, my religious beliefs are my beliefs, and I'm not going to talk about my religious beliefs when I'm running for a public office. Just say that kind of stuff and don't get into trouble. And I think that's a much better approach, because you open up the door and you let the Democrats create the fear in the minds of a lot of voters that if they vote Democrat, that's the end of their life as they know it, that they're never going to be able to have a contraception, or they're not going to be able to have an abortion if they want one. Even if they pay for it with their own money, the government's going to be snooping in their bedrooms, and you don't want to create that idea in the mind of the voters, that threat, even though it's not legitimate. It's just that the Republicans feel compelled to talk about these issues. And a lot of it is because of the primary process. To win a primary, you got to appeal to the religious element, the social conservatives that are in the Republican Party. And while they're good people, I wish they would recognize the toll that this ultimately takes, I believe, on the general election. And look, you got a good Catholic, you got a good Christian running for office, fine. Just don't make the election or the primary a referendum on their religious beliefs. Just accept that they have them, and let's elect presidents based on what they feel about the economy, the Constitution, not necessarily how they feel about God, and just leave that between the candidate and God, and don't just bring it out there front and center into the political discussion. Now, I know there are some Democrats that probably appreciate this as well, but I think we're losing more votes in the general election than we're gaining by following that approach.
Brian in Santa Rosa, California asks, as a libertarian/conservative, what states do you think are most friendly to live in for taxes, personal liberties, business, and entrepreneurship?
Well, that's a pretty easy question. I think all you have to do is look at the taxes that don't have, or excuse me, all you have to do is look at the states that don't have a personal income tax, and there's your answer. Because these are states that at least believe in limiting government to the extent that there's no income tax. And of course, once you have an income tax and you allow the government access to that source of funds, government is going to grow a lot faster since it can rely on income taxes to fuel that growth. So states that don't have an income tax are going to be forced to keep a limit on the size of their government because they can't afford to finance it. So what are those states? Obviously Nevada out west, Washington State, you've got Texas as another state, you got Wyoming. So you've got a number of states out west that you can look at that don't have a personal income tax. On the East Coast, you've got New Hampshire up north, you've got Florida down south. Those are two states that have no income tax. In the middle, you got Tennessee. Tennessee doesn't tax wages and salaries. They still have an income tax on capital gains and I believe on interest and dividends. So they've got their foot in the door, but they don't tax your salary or your wages. So that's kind of something they got going for them. And I forget if I've left any of the no income tax states out, but they're there. You do have places to choose from. And I wouldn't even want to be in a state, if you're moving for tax reasons, don't even go to a state that has an income tax, even if it's low. Because believe me, if they already have the framework there, if they're collecting an income tax and it's low, it's probably not going to stay low. It's just going to go up. Because I think once the camel's nose is under the tent when it comes to an income tax, they're going to keep raising the rates. And of course, once you give the government that pipeline of money, it's going to keep on flowing. The government's going to keep on getting bigger and bigger. If there is no ability to tax income at all, then it's going to keep the reins on government spending, and so you're safer. So that's what I would look at. And of course, if you look at all those states that don't have income taxes, they have better job growth. They're the ones that are gaining in population, and coincidentally, I think those are also the states that have been going for. Well, actually, no. I mean, this year, some of those states actually went for the president. Actually, quite a few of them, surprisingly enough, went the president's way in this most recent election. But that doesn't mean that a income tax is on the horizon. I think far from it. But I guess, the states that are overwhelmingly Republican, like Wyoming, I believe maybe was 2-1 Republican versus Democrat. The odds that they're going to come in with an income tax are probably pretty slim. Probably the same thing in Texas. I mean, I doubt New Hampshire, even though it went for the president. I mean, they're pretty much against the income tax in that state. So I think the odds of an income tax rearing its ugly head are pretty slim, even if they did vote for Obama this time. Maybe because they just didn't like Mitt Romney. They were too familiar with him, and in some cases, familiarity breeds contempt, and that was certainly the case because Mitt Romney not only lost New Hampshire, he lost Massachusetts. But the president won narrowly in Florida. Florida's kind of a swing state, but they got a Republican governor, and so that's a good sign. Also, look at the fiscal positions. The worse fiscally they're in. You got a state like California with a big deficit. Where I am in Connecticut, they have big deficits. they're just going to raise income taxes in order to pay those deficits. So whatever the tax rate is now, if you look at a state that is fiscally irresponsible, has deficits, especially if you look at a state where they have a lot of government workers, certainly relative to the population, unionized civil service workers, that's a recipe for disaster, because they're going to constantly work to reelect the state representatives that are going to constantly vote for more pay for those unionized workers that help elect them, which means the taxpayers in those states are simply going to be left twisting in the wind. So this is a situation where the high tax states are just going to keep raising taxes, and it's going to mean that the benefit to being in a low tax state is going to get wider and wider as time passes, and that will act as a magnet. And as people leave the high tax states and go to the low tax states, the tax base in the low tax states will get bigger and bigger, and therefore they'll have even more money to provide essential services. Meanwhile, the high tax states keep chasing their tax base out of the state, which means they have to keep raising taxes even faster on the few taxpayers who remain in those states. And of course, then as they turn up the heat, even more people want to leave, and it's a self-perpetuating spiral. So it's better, if you're already thinking these thoughts, it's better to move sooner rather than later, because I think the sooner you move, the more money you'll save.
Sue in Scranton, Pennsylvania asks, I invested a good bit of my money in gold and silver coins. Now how do I go about investing in oil and gas?
All right, well, hopefully you bought your gold and silver coins from Euro-Pacific Precious Metals. If you didn't know about that company, that's my personal gold and silver company. You can check them out. Either go to shiftgold.com or europacmetals.com. But as far as investing directly in oil, I mean, there are funds that you can own. There are ETFs that trade in the U.S. and abroad where you can directly own oil or other type energy products. You're not going to take physical possession of crude oil the way you did gold and silver. You're not going to have barrels of oil delivered to your front porch. So if you do want to make a direct play, there are exchange-traded funds that will allow you exposure to that sector. Now, not knowing your circumstances, I really can't make a recommendation to you on this format because of security regulations. But what I can suggest that you do is contact my brokerage firm, Euro-Pacific Capital, and talk to somebody there, talk to an individual broker. He can decide or assess your situation to see if some of these investment vehicles might in fact be suitable for your situation, and then you can open up an account and we can certainly make recommendations as to the way you can gain exposure directly to that sector. Then of course you can look at ancillary exposure. For example, when it comes to precious metals, you can look at companies that mine precious metals. The same thing with energy. You can invest in oil, or you can invest in companies that operate in the oil sector and that make more money as oil prices increase. But again, all of those specific ideas need to be given to you in a one-on-one format where we make sure that the advice is suitable for the person to whom we are giving it. So again, just call up Euro-Pacific Capital, or the website is Europac, EUROPAC.net.
Chinatsu in Toronto, Canada asks, how would the Austrian school handle prickly issues such as drugs or prostitution?
Well, I don't know whether or not the Austrian economists weighed in on those subjects for sure, but I know how I handle them, and I'm assuming that the Austrian economists would feel the same way. And that prostitution and drugs are what you would call a victimless crime, in that if somebody wants to hire a prostitute, and if somebody wants to offer their services as a prostitute, and you have two willing and consenting adults, then nobody is injured. The same thing with drugs. If a consenting adult decides that he wants to do drugs, and there's somebody willing to provide those drugs for a fee, the person who is buying the drugs, if anyone is going to suffer, it's the person who's using the drugs, but he's chosen, he's an adult, he's made his own decision. And a free market economist would say, look, if whatever you want to do to yourself, right or wrong, is your right. I mean, even if doing drugs is bad, and even if doing drugs might not be in the best interest of the individual who's taking the drugs, that's not up to society to make that call. That's not up to somebody else. That's up to an adult. Now, can society come in and protect minors? Should a drug dealer be able to sell drugs to a 10-year-old? Of course not. The 10-year-old is not old enough to know what's right for him. We do protect minors from making poor decisions because they haven't lived long enough to be intelligent enough to do it. The same thing with prostitution. You can't have an underage girl as a prostitute, even if she's willing to work as a prostitute. You can't knowingly patronize a 15-year-old prostitute, right? That should be a crime. Because it's not victimless, because you can look at a young girl and say, hey, she's not old enough to understand the consequences of what she's doing, and this adult is taking advantage of her. But when you have consenting adults, whatever that age may be, you might debate whether or not 18 is old enough. Maybe it's not. Maybe you should be 21. Because a lot of 18-year-olds still don't really, I don't know that they're mature enough to make these decisions. I would say that the age of consent, I think, needs to be a little higher than 18. But whatever society agrees, you make a point, and then it's up to individuals to do. There are people that say, but drugs aren't a victimless crime because look at all the gangs, look at all the violence associated with drugs. But all of that is a function of drugs being illegal. All the violence that's associated with drugs is because drugs are illegal. It's the war on drugs that is responsible for all the crimes. So you can say, well, what if somebody does drugs and then commits a crime? That's not the problem. I mean, a lot of people, they smoke pot. The last thing they want to do is commit a crime. I mean, they're high. They're just, they're probably less likely. If you look at a criminal and you got him stoned, he'd probably, be less likely to commit a crime. He would just maybe, he'd just have the munchies and he'd hang out at home and he wouldn't be doing anything. But what they do, you take a heroin addict, and heroin is very expensive, or a cocaine addict, and where do these addicts get the money to buy their cocaine? They got to steal it. That's where the crime comes in. If drugs were legal and a lot less expensive, well, then the drug addicts wouldn't have to commit crimes to support their habits. So when you make these things illegal, you create victims. The victims of the drug laws are the people who get robbed by drug addicts, who wouldn't be robbed if drugs were legal, or if somebody gets killed in the crossfire of a turf battle between two gangs. Right? That wouldn't happen if drugs were legal. You don't see people having shootouts in the street over cigarettes or over alcohol. Now, they used to do that over alcohol back during Prohibition. When alcohol was illegal, there was all sorts of alcohol-related crime. But when alcohol was decriminalized again, the crime went away, or it simply moved into narcotics or gambling or anything else that was illegal, and the government forced underground. So all these, and I would throw gambling in there as well. These are, the government should stay out. If somebody wants to spend their money gambling, if a consenting adult wants to gamble, they want to go to the racetrack, or they want to play poker or play the slot machines, hey, it's not up to the government to say you can't do that. In fact, the biggest hypocrisy when it comes to government is the government makes it illegal to gamble, yet the government sells lottery tickets. I mean, the biggest promoters of gambling in the United States are governments trying to convince poor people to buy lottery tickets. And the worst gamble you can make, the worst odds you're ever going to get anywhere in America is in a lottery ticket. Anybody else where gambling is legal, right? Whether it's Nevada, whether it's on the casino, the Indian reservations, every private company that is gambling gives their customers much better odds than the states. The lotteries are the worst odds you're ever going to get, and yet there are advertisements all over the airways of every state encouraging poor people that can't afford to lose to buy a lottery ticket. So the whole thing is hypocrisy, right? If gambling is bad, then let's get rid of the lottery tickets. If it's not bad, then legalize it. Personally, I'd like to see an elimination of all these lotteries, but allow private sector gambling, where the customers get a much better deal than the lousy deal they get from the state. But again, I'm pretty sure this is what the Austrians would say: freedom, limited government. This is a personal liberty issue. It's none of the government's business what consenting adults do with their free time, or what they do with their body, or what they decide to do with their body. The only time the government has to step in is to protect some people from other people. right? The government is not there to protect me from myself. So if I want to eat fatty foods, if I want to smoke cigarettes, if I want to take drugs, if I want to go to prostitutes or all these things, that's my business. It's not up to the government. But but the government should protect me from violent acts of other people. So if someone's trying to steal from me, if someone's trying to force me to do something, then that's where the government protects me from other people who would do harm to me. They don't protect me from myself, even if I do harm to myself, because that's my right. Which means if I don't want to wear a safety belt, if I don't want to wear a helmet, even though those are probably good ideas, if you're riding on a motorcycle, it's a good idea to wear a helmet. But if I don't want to, if I just want to, take my chances, well, then that's my right to do that. And if I get into an accident, if I get hurt, it's my own damn fault. And if I die, hey, those are the breaks. I'm an adult. I can decide for myself. Now, if I got a minor on the back of that motorcycle, and the state wants to say, hey, if you put a 15-year-old on the back of your motorcycle, you better put a helmet on his head. Hey, that makes a lot of sense to me, because that 15-year-old, hey, maybe that 15-year-old isn't smart enough to know how dangerous it is to be on a motorcycle without a helmet. And the state can come in and protect minors, but not consenting adults, because once you are of the age of majority, you can make decisions for yourself, and it's none of the government's business, and it's not your neighbor's business. And if your neighbor can't force you to do something, he can't force you to do something by going to government and getting government to force you to do it.
Skylar in Kent, Michigan asks, my daughter has Down syndrome and is very dependent on others for even the simplest tasks. My husband and I work full-time and never have been able to raise her without the public school system. Does free market libertarianism have a practical solution for schooling and caring for people with special needs like her?
Well, absolutely. When you're looking at the situation today and saying, well, we couldn't have done anything without the public education, well, you don't know, because the public education is here. That system is in place, and it's stifling innovation and other private sector alternatives that would exist absent the public schools. Remember, if we didn't have the public schools, taxes would be much, much lower for people who live in the school districts. And so what would all these families do with all this extra money that they weren't paying in taxes? Well, that money would be used to educate their children privately. So all sorts of private sector schools would, sprout up to fill that demand, because parents want their children exercised. Want their children educated. You don't need government to force parents to educate their children. It's, parents feed their children, they clothe their children, they shelter their children. Most parents teach their kids to talk, they teach their kids to walk. They're not idiots. They're going to help their children grow into adulthood, matriculate into society, and they're going to want to, impart upon them the skills that they need. After all, you take a lot of government out of the equation. If you raise an uneducated kid, you're going to end up responsible. You're going to end up having to take care of the kid his whole life, because if you raise him, if he's illiterate, what kind of job is he gonna have? So parents have a vested interest on so many different levels. Nobody cares more about your kid than a parent, right? In fact, in my example about the motorcycle, I'd be willing to bet that any father who is riding a motorcycle without a helmet probably voluntarily puts a helmet on his child on the back of that motorcycle, because he might take a chance with his own life, but he would never take a chance with his child's life. Parents always care more about their children. So if there was no public school system, there'd be plenty of private sector schools, and there would be private sector schools for children with special needs. There would be schools for children with Down syndrome. Where would you get the money to send your kid to that specialized school? Well, you would have it, because you wouldn't be paying all the taxes that you're currently paying now to fund the public sector schools, which probably don't even do nearly as good a job as a specialized private school would do, that you would more likely have access to if we didn't have this government school system that was basically supplanting all of that and preventing all that from happening. Now, what happens in the circumstances where people are born to a very poor family, and maybe these specialized schools are a little bit more expensive than normal schools, and maybe you don't have the resources to send your kids to one of these specialized schools, that's where scholarships come in. Almost all private schools that cater to a particular type of student and that charge money have endowments, they have the ability to give scholarships based on special situations, based on need, and there are probably charities that are set up to help children who are born into poor situations, who might need special help, and if their parents can't afford it, private charities will step in, or these schools, out of a sense of charity, will maybe lower the tuition or charge nothing. This happens all the time in the free market. The free market is very good at taking care of the needy. The free market is much better at doing that than the government. The government creates need. Right? The more government you have, the more poor people you have, because they feed off that poverty. They feed off that dependency. They do the exact opposite. The less government you have, the more freedom and opportunity you have, so you have less poverty. And whatever poverty is there, whenever somebody falls through the cracks, you don't have a poverty industry trying to keep them down so they can bleed them dry. What you have is legitimate charitable enterprises that are funded by people who care, who have a lot more money to help the needy, because they're not getting bled to death by the government in the form of high taxes. So people are making more money, they're keeping more money, and they're giving more money away to charitable causes. So everybody wins in a free market, and everybody loses with big government. The problem is the big government lie, is easy for a lot of people to believe. It sounds great, right? When somebody promises you not something for nothing, it has a lot of appeal to the people who get something for nothing. In order to understand why capitalism and freedom are so good, you have to have the intellect to appreciate the concept. You have to think. And unfortunately, in our country, there's not a lot of thinking when it comes to voting. It's all emotion. It's fear, it's greed, it's envy, it's revenge. Who knows why people vote? But most votes, I don't believe, or at least the votes that are determining the outcomes, are not based on reason or intellect, but raw emotion, how you feel. And that's what the politicians can tap into when they promise socialism. I mean, after all, look at, recently they had a poll of young Americans, and more Americans had confidence in socialism, believed in the tenets of socialism than in capitalism. And how was that possible? I mean, how is it possible that anybody, given the abysmal failure of socialism and the obvious successes of capitalism, how anybody could prefer socialism to capitalism, to have more faith in socialism than capitalism? It shows you just how pathetic these public schools are, that they can turn out a product that's so defective, and yet they're still in business. It's all because it was government. If we had private schools and there was a private school that was turning out students of the quality that the public schools are routinely putting them out, they would go bankrupt because they'd have no customers, because no parent would buy that education voluntarily. They would pull their kids out of those schools and put them in decent schools. That's why the public schools don't want vouchers. They don't want school choice, because they know nobody would choose the disaster that is American public education.